In the interest of time, let's launch. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Slattery. I am the Senior Director for Financial Aid at Northeastern University. Today, I represent the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. Given my title, you can guess at my background. I've worked in financial aid for a number of years. Over the many years, you can see looking at the screen that I'm old. I've also worked in admissions. I've worked for the College Board, some other agencies associated with higher ed. I mention that only for your perspective, and especially as you ask questions or think about questions that you might have during the session. Beyond that, it's only as good as the session. If it's a lousy session, my background doesn't do you any good, correct? I also want to acknowledge the venue and the technology. This is a great way to get to multiple people. It's a great way to get to you during the middle of the day when you might be at work, you might be doing your lunch while you're listening to me. But it's a difficult tool in the sense that I can't see you. I can't see you react. Ideally, I'm in a room with you and I get to see your faces. I get to see you shake heads as you acknowledge things. So that said, I urge you to ask questions. You're going to hear in a moment how you can pose questions during the session. I'll try to get to questions at the end, but I also urge you to go back and review this if necessary, not because it's me, but because sometimes having multiple passes at this information helps you digest it more easily and deal with it more easily. So I urge you to take advantage of that and know otherwise than beyond my own native limitations, we have other limitations with the technology. I'm going to switch to my colleague, Jonathan from MEFA, to touch on this next slide.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jim, for that. And thanks, everyone, for joining us here today. I will be available when you have questions throughout this presentation, as you will. You can type them into the Q&A section, and I will be responding to those as we go. So that's part of how you can participate in the webinar. You can see you can control the audio settings. The chat feature, it says is disabled. It actually is not. We have not disabled it. So you could actually access us by the chat or the Q&A. I prefer the Q&A just because it's easier for me to see when it comes up. But either way, I'll try to get to it. And then if you need the live transcript feature, you can click on that and it will give you, as I said, the live transcript of the text of the words that we're saying. And so again, submit your questions as we go. If I think your question is important for the entire group to hear, I may kick that over to Jim to answer out loud in front of everybody. Or if I know we're going to get to it at a later point, I might hold on to it for a little bit. But your questions will be answered, and you will receive afterwards, as Jim said, a recording of this presentation. You can always reach out to us later with more questions. So thank you very much and enjoy.
Thanks, Jonathan. Who is MEFA? What is MEFA? MEFA, as I mentioned, is the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. It's a not-for-profit state authority. They were created in 1982. They're quasi-public, not-for-profit is the easiest way to think about them. But MEFA not only offers lending tools and financing tools, but by state charter, they offer programs and services and information for families. And I urge you to take advantage of their information. I do not work for MEFA. I do not get paid for these sessions. However, I've observed them in their many years since they've been around, and they provide quality information for families. They have terrific tools online. They have these kinds of programs, and they're all there to help you. And it's all very good, high quality, neutral information. So I urge you to take advantage of that. Our topics today, I'm going to keep working through these topics. We've scheduled for about an hour, a little bit more, and we have probably 3 hours of content, right? I think there's a crude joke, old joke in there about 3 hours of content fit into an hour. But hopefully today what we get through are types and sources of financial aid. I'll cover this as our baseline knowledge. This will help you understand as we get further into the session. And we'll talk about reviewing the application process. The application process I'll go through fairly quickly. There's a lot of good information about application processes. And truth be told, the application process will differ somewhat depending on the colleges to which you're applying or your sons or daughters are applying. So I'll give that an overview, but really you want to be reviewing the application process for each individual school. We'll spend a good bit of time on understanding how financial aid decisions are made. I feel like this is where I can help you most. As I said, there's good information out there about types and sources of aid. There's good information about the application process. How these decisions are made are very mysterious for families, right? And it's even mysterious for school counselors who have very good experience and years of experience, but unless they're within a particular institution, it may be mysterious as to how that institution's making decisions. So I want to shed some light on that, dispel that. If we have time at the end, we'll talk about learning to pay for college, uh, techniques and kind of tools or best practices that you can use in paying for college. And there are also lots of good resources that are part of this presentation. And once again, if we don't get through all those or I get through them quickly at the end, I urge you to go back and access that information. It's terrific information. It's stuff you can go back to, you can write down and access again, mostly electronically. And I urge you not to ignore that or forget about that. So let's jump right into types and sources of financial aid. What is financial aid? Quite simply, money that helps students pay for college, right? So colleges have tuition, fees, there are other related expenses. You as consumer or the student as the learner have a responsibility to pay for that, but there are resources out there through the government, through states, through the individual colleges themselves that help pay for this what can become a very expensive resource. There are three main types. There are tons of different types of financial aid, truly, but I'm going to lump them into three categories. One, grants and scholarships, the good stuff, right? Free stuff. So grants and scholarships can be applied toward your bill. In some cases, it might be applied to other expenses like room and board, or it might even be sufficient enough to help with expenses beyond tuition and room and board. But the point is, it's gift aid goes to those expenses. It's something you do not have to pay back. You do not directly work for this. You do indirectly because students have to keep up their grades and maintain other criteria, perhaps in order to keep scholarships. But for the most part, it's free aid, and that's why in parentheses we're calling it gift aid. The good stuff, the best of these three types. The second type is federal work study. Federal work study is a program through the government that allows students to work on campus. It's considered by financial aid, by the government because they provide the funds for these jobs. So for colleges that may not have the funding to hire students in offices on campus, or they may have limited funding, the government provides this funding for campuses. It allows students to work, and very often students are putting those earnings toward personal expenses, books, and similar. For work study, we're going to talk about this later when we talk about actual awards. It's only as good as the student working, right? So you may be offered a work study award, but unless the student gets a job and earns money, it's only an offer up until the point of actual work. Again, we'll touch on that. And federal student loans. Today, for this purpose, I'm restricting my look at true student loans, which are currently the Stafford Loan Program, subsidized, unsubsidized Stafford loans. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. Some of you are already thinking, loans, why is that financial aid? Federal student loans are considered financial aid because the money and the underlying program costs are borne by the government. And what do I mean by that? Very simply, the government is providing money for unsecured loans for 17-year-olds, typically with no credit history, sometimes no way of earning money, and they're providing very good rates and very good terms. So since there's an expense related to that, they consider it financial aid. For the student, for you, it can be an inexpensive way to borrow a portion of these costs. Nobody is pushing borrowing. Student loans should remain a safe kind of percentage or proportion of any kind of financial aid package. And the federal system is designed to be just that. So I caution you about student loans, but from the government standpoint, it's still a form of financial aid and still available to students and families. So what are these sources? I've already alluded to the federal government. It's perhaps, we sometimes show you a slide, we will not today, that shows the whole complement of aid that was administered within a recent year. And if you look at that complement, the largest source of aid nationally is the federal government. The collection of federal grants, work study, and these student loans. The federal government also considers incentives for education a form of financial aid, or providing it for financial aid. You're getting that benefit through tax returns and the tax system, but for the government, it's still considered financial aid and available to you to help with these costs. States also have forms of financial aid. And in the case of Massachusetts, Massachusetts has a grant program. It has some scholarship programs and other programs. There are outside agencies. So I'm going clockwise. I'm down in the bottom right corner. There are outside agencies that have scholarships, private scholarships, everything from your local library to the Kiwanis Club to the Gates Foundation, you name it. There are some very good database tools and search tools that are available online that allow you to explore and apply for these scholarships. And two of the largest and better ones are listed here. Their links are here. Take advantage of those. We'll touch on outside scholarships later when we talk about aid as well. And the second biggest resource is the bottom left corner, colleges and universities themselves, institutional financial aid, especially at private institutions, in the Northeast. Northeast private colleges and universities are quite expensive. It's aligned with our cost of living and other kinds of expenses. It probably doesn't surprise you. But because those colleges and universities are expensive, and despite the amount of overall federal financial aid available, federal financial aid for individuals very often comes up short for more expensive private colleges. So these colleges themselves administer financial aid, and it's really the second largest source out of this slide that you're looking at. And for those of you applying to private colleges, it's what you need to think about and what we'll focus on quite a bit during the session today. Again, the assumption isn't that you're all applying to these private colleges, but that's where the mystery lies. And as I said at the beginning, where I feel I can help you the most. Within gift aid, the gift aid category, I talked about scholarships, and a type of scholarship is merit-based aid. And merit-based aid is based, as the slide implies, very much on achievement, most commonly academic achievement. So you hear about students and get a scholarship because of high school achievement, perhaps because of standardized test scores, other kinds of achievement. Scholarships are considered a form of merit-based aid. Some colleges and universities that have an emphasis on the arts may award merit-based scholarships for students in performing arts or even fine arts. Band, some colleges have merit scholarships for band players, band participants, and so on. Look, if you're offered these scholarships, make sure that at some point you look at and understand the terms. Some of them are renewable, some are not. So some merit scholarships are offered for first year, but they may not be renewable. Some are renewable, but they're renewable based on certain terms, the most common being a certain grade point average, especially for academic scholarships. Not every college has merit scholarships. In fact, some of the most competitive colleges nationally, many of the Ivy League colleges, for example, do not have merit-based aid. That's a surprise for a lot of families. They have need-based aid, but very often no merit-based aid at all. Some colleges will have a separate application for their merit-based aid. For some colleges, just by virtue of applying through admission, you're considered for all of their merit scholarships. In other cases, they may have a separate application process for those scholarships. That's to check with the individual colleges, check their websites, talk to their admissions representatives, talk to the financial aid office, but you should know that for each individual school. And for those that have applications, some of them have very early deadlines. In fact, some colleges, have merit-based application deadlines that precede their admission deadline. That's a little bit of a trick, something to be wary of. If you're interested in scholarships at some of the colleges that are on your list, this is for the families of seniors, right? If you're a senior family, you're thinking about this right now. We're going to get into deadlines in a moment, but watch to see if their scholarship applications might precede their regular application. The other large form of gift aid is need-based aid, based on financial eligibility. We use the term need, it's tossed all around the financial aid business. I like to say eligibility. You know what your need is. Colleges can determine eligibility within their own rules and the federal rules, but you really know what your need is. But we refer to this chunk of money as need-based aid. That need is determined through standardized formula. In the case of federal awards and state awards, it's determined using the FAFSA form, which we're going to talk about in a moment, a national federal form. But many institutions will use different forms for their own money, something to be aware of, and something we're going to talk a lot about today, the separation between analysis for federal and state funds versus analysis for institutional funds. I'm planting that seed to keep listening and paying attention to that distinction as I talk today. Need-based aid isn't restricted to gift aid, even though I started this separating it as a form of gift aid. Most of the loans that I've talked about, Stafford loan, are based on need or eligibility. Work study is based on need or eligibility, and many institutional grants based on need or eligibility. Most institutional money, all federal money, much of the state money available is all based on need. Okay, let's leap right into the process. So we know some of you may be cold to this process. Some of you have started to do your research. Some of you may have older sons or daughters that have already participated through this process. But we know intuitively, even if you're cold and this is your first time hearing about the aid process, there is some kind of process, right? And we know, even if we haven't heard the details yet, there's usually a form or forms involved, right? So nationally, we try to make this a standardized process, and that's where we're going to talk about forms. But let's first touch on timeline. You'll notice in bold, underlined letters right in the middle of this slide, don't submit applications late. Sounds like really pithy advice, doesn't it? Is that the most brilliant thing you could come up with in the session? Don't submit applications late. Well, it would be surprising to you how many families do submit applications late. Let me beat this to death a little bit. There are some colleges and universities that administer money first come, first serve. That's rare. It's not common. So I don't want to make you nervous about that kind of administration, but it does exist. Other colleges do a form of first come, first serve where they evaluate you a certain way as long as you applied on time. And if you're a late applicant, then it's funds available. Now, let me give you an example of this. The family who applied for financial aid did not qualify for financial aid when applying, but later, several months later, so the family applied in January, and in May, mom or dad become unemployed. So their financial circumstances have changed dramatically. They follow up with the institution and say, listen, we would like you to consider our change in circumstances. And the institution reconsiders for that family and learns that they are now eligible for aid. And because the family originally applied on time, that family is going to get some funding. There's the corollary to that case where the family did not apply because the family thought we may not be eligible for financial aid. The same change in circumstances later, they check in with the college and say, can we now appeal and you look at our change in circumstances? And the college says, absolutely, you can. And we've reevaluated and we can see that you're eligible, but because you're late, we don't have the funds available. Again, that's an extreme example. It may not be the most common example, but if I can reinforce today the seriousness of making sure you get applications in on time, initial requirements from colleges in on time. Sometimes you may need additional documentation. Most colleges will look at the initial application and allow you to send in additional documentation following. If they ask you for additional information and it's past the deadline, they typically will not penalize you for that. That's their choice. But that initial application, you want to get in on time. These initial applications for senior families are starting now, soon. The FAFSA is available today. You can start filling out the FAFSA today. If you're considering early decision or early action programs, many of those programs have deadlines in October, less common, more commonly deadlines in November or December. It's not uncommon now for colleges for regular decision, not early action, for regular decision to have deadlines as early as January. So these dates are coming up fast. For many regular decision schools, those deadlines might be as late as February or March, but hardly any are any later than that now. So this is something to be thinking about now and checking deadlines for individual colleges and institutions. Take advantage of MEFA's application manager. There's a link here, and it can help you monitor and keep organized all of this information. Everyone needs to fill out the FAFSA. FAFSA, free application for federal student aid. It's a national standardized form. It's required by all colleges that administer financial aid. It's available now. It was available on October 1st. It's something you don't need to complete it tonight, but I urge you as early as tonight or this weekend to get familiar with the form, to at least establish your FSA ID. You see this in the slide, FSA Federal Student Aid ID. It's an ID that all student applicants need, and parents, the parents who are participating in the application with the student, need as well. You can establish an ID whenever. You will have a unique ID. Their daughters will maintain that forever. In a few short years, when they have their own children applying for aid with their, they'll still use that ID, and their kids will have their own ID. I already told you the FAFSA, National Federal Standardized Form. Some good news about FAFSA. It's been around for a long time. It's become easier to complete. It's been shortened. There are currently initiatives to shorten it even further and make it more simplified for families and easier to understand. The questions on the form and instructions for the form have improved dramatically over the years. It's an online process. The online process works well. There's little downtime, there's little error. Processing is quick. There is now a link with the IRS, so some of your tax information can be retrieved directly from the IRS. That sounds scary, but it's actually a convenience for you. It saves time, it saves mistakes, it saves on inconsistent information. It sounds like I'm pitching for the government, but as someone who's been around for a long time, the FAFSA is a much improved application process than it was 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. So I'm trying to put you at ease a bit. You hear about the overwhelming nature of this process. You're providing private information, income information. The FAFSA is not too bad. The other good news about FAFSA is that you complete it once, and that information for incoming students can be sent to multiple institutions. So you complete the form. When completing the form, you indicate the colleges to which you're applying, and that information can be sent to multiple colleges. So you're not completing this form for each individual school. You're doing it once. You do, however, need to complete FAFSA each year. So once your son or daughter begins attending an institution, you will complete the FAFSA the next year, junior year, senior year, and so on for that particular institution. But again, you do it once each year. What's reported on the FAFSA? It has general demographic information, as you can imagine, student information. It asks for social security number. It's one of the few, if the only system through the government that requires that you provide a social security number. Many of us don't like that. We're uncomfortable about sharing social security numbers, but your FAFSA will not be processed without it. Each college to which you're applying, I just talked about this, will receive information from the FAFSA. The FAFSA includes student information and it includes parent information. Who is the parent? The parents here are listed, and the form itself has very specific instructions. So if you have complicated parental circumstances, walk through the instructions on the form. It's not too bad, and it's very specific. So for example, it's saying here, married parents, even same-sex marriages, those parents are included on the form. Parents who live together, even if they're not married, for example, included on the form. If the parents are divorced or separated, the custodial parent completes this form. The non-custodial parent is excluded. But if the custodial parent now has a new spouse or live-in, that person's information is on the form. Legal guardians are not considered parents. There was a day where legal guardians would complete this form, but they no longer need to do that. The form asks for the size of the household. It asks for the number of children in college, and then it asks for financial information, tax information, as I've already implied. Much of that tax information can be imported through the IRS, as we already talked about. The form asks for information about assets, cash, savings, checking accounts, investments in stocks and bonds. There are some assets conspicuously that are not included on the FAFSA. Number one is your home. So if you have a high value home or you have a lot of equity in your home, that information is not included on FAFSA. Secondly, retirement assets. So if you have assets, investments in qualified retirement plans, and by qualified retirement plans, I mean pension plans, 529, not 529, I'm sorry, 401k, 403b, excuse me, 401k, 403b, qualified pension plans, those assets are excluded from the FAFSA. If you happen to have invested in the market straight out for retirement, you will need to include those assets. But retirement in the home, large assets are not included on the FAFSA form and not considered in analysis for federal and state aid. Now, many private colleges, I alluded to this already, so many private colleges award substantial amounts of financial aid because they may be more expensive, because the amount of federal aid available to individual families may only make a dent in that expense. So most high-cost colleges are also awarding significant amounts of financial aid. Along with the FAFSA becoming a more simplified form and a shorter form, it means there's less information. That's good news for families. For a complex private institution that's trying to award its money according to its rules, the FAFSA very often doesn't have enough information. So most private colleges with significant amounts of financial aid need more information than the FAFSA. Many then participate in a process in a form called the CSS Profile. The profile is administered through the College Board. The form itself is built, it's structured like the FAFSA. It has a lot of the questions that the FAFSA already includes, but it's much more detailed. More detail about tax information. I also told you that asset information like home value, home equity is not included on the FAFSA. It is included on the profile. The profile will ask you information about those retirement assets that I referred to. However, 99.9% of institutions using the profile do not use those retirement assets in their analysis. So I want to reassure you, some you may hear advice or read that retirement assets are not considered in these evaluations. They are not, and then be surprised when you see a question on the profile. That question's informational. That's probably tough to buy and tough to trust from a guy that's talking to you on video at lunchtime. But I promise you that for 99.9% of the colleges, they're not using those retirement assets. To give you some perspective on profile versus FAFSA, I told you all colleges require FAFSA. There are 4,000 plus colleges and universities in the country. There are perhaps 300 and some odd colleges, 300, who use profile. So it's a minority of these schools. And I apologize a little bit that we're going to talk a bit about profile and that analysis, but again, it's because it's the expense of schools. the straightforward low-cost college, if you're applying to a community college with very reasonable, accessible costs, the federal form and federal process and federal monies available typically are going to be sufficient, even if you have high need. But if you're applying to these private colleges, they're going to want more information. Very often they use the profile. The profile, like the FAFSA, you can complete once and send to multiple institutions. So that's the good news. Many colleges that do require additional information ask for profile because they know then that you'll only have to do this process once. It's a standardized process, so you're filling very similar information as FAFSA and for each college. This information to process profile, excuse me, there is a fee, unlike the FAFSA, which is free. Fees are listed here. For families who are high need families, low income families, families accessing federal assistance, there are waivers through the profile process. They're automatic. They're very generous. In other words, a large percentage of profile applicants qualify for these waivers. So I don't want you to get too caught up in the cost, but there is a cost to administer the form, and therefore that's why it's applied here as opposed to the federal system. The bottom of this slide references college financial aid applications. So for the same logic that some colleges require profile, they want more information that FAFSA can provide. They want more detailed information. They want different information. Some colleges also have their own financial aid application. It's rarer. So in order of commonality, it's FAFSA everybody, 300 some odd schools requiring profile, some colleges requiring their own application. But most that want their own information think we're going to make the process a little bit easier on you by requiring profile, and at least you'll have some commonality with other schools to which you're applying. Bottom line is, check the requirements for that institution, just as you're going to be checking admission requirements. Do they want standardized test scores or not? Are they optional? Are they required? Do they require a transcript? When do they need this information? What do they need by way of financial aid information? They're always going to need FAFSA. Do they need profile? Do they have an institutional application? And what dates do they need these by? Like FAFSA, profile became available October 1st and available all through the application year. I'm going to take a quick breath. If Jonathan has some key questions, I'm going to pause. But again, we're already halfway through the session, so I want to keep pushing through, but I'll give Jonathan a chance to interrupt me.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. You know, there hasn't been too much yet. You're explaining everything so well. I'm having a few good conversations with some folks, but I think there's a few questions on sending profiles to multiple colleges and how that would work.
Oh,
so yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So again, profile and FAFSA have similar processes in this sense. Both are electronic applications. There will be a point within each application, these are the commonalities, and then I'll get into the differences, where it asks you to indicate the colleges to which you want that information sent. Think about it, most of you who have dealt with test scores, SAT scores, or ACT scores. Your sons and daughters participated in those tests, and then the test said what colleges you're applying to. We send that information, we send the results to individual colleges. There are same processes for FAFSA and for profile. If you're uncertain about profile, ultimately, I just suggested to you, you check the college's information, either their application materials, which they might mail to you still, they might send you a packet of information, but they always have information available online, or you can ask them directly, do they require profile? If you're uncertain, the other double check, or the other standard, is when you're applying and you're in profile and completing the form itself, you search for an institution. If the institution doesn't exist, they don't require profile. You also cannot send profile. You can't waste your money and send profile to a school that does not require it or accept it. So that's also a little safety valve. If you think college B requires profile and you try to send it, you're trying to be good about it. If they don't require the form, you will not be able to send it and you won't waste your money. But the process is similar in that in both cases, you access the information for these colleges within the application itself. You indicate the institutions to which you're applying. Behind the scenes, this slide is perfect now. It's the segue. Excuse me. What happens after you apply? So you've sent out this mysterious FAFSA form to some dark agency behind the scenes, some federal processor. You've sent the profile form to the college board and their processor. That information gets evaluated. It goes through a series of computations, and results are sent to those individual colleges that you've indicated. Results are also sent to you. In the case of the FAFSA, you get a thing called the student aid report. You choose up front whether you get that by mail or email. In the case of profile, you also get electronic confirmation. You don't get the same kind of report as the student aid report, but you do get electronic confirmation and information. And that same information, some cases even more detailed information, is sent to the individual colleges. It's the college's job then to look at your application, look at that information that they've received, determine your eligibility for aid, and then what funding you have available. And that's where we move into now the process, how these decisions are made. As a quick aside, I want to touch on the verification process. There's a federal, somewhat random system where the government wants to verify a certain number, a certain percentage of applications that are being processed through the FAFSA system. Excuse me. You may be informed by an individual institution that you've been chosen for verification. It's not a bad thing. It's not a scary thing. It's not something to get wound up about, but I don't want you to be surprised by it. So some colleges may say, you've been selected for verification. We need additional information. We need some information that we wouldn't otherwise request, but we use this information in order to satisfy the verification requirements for the government. It's a side process. Some colleges don't do this process until after you've been admitted, and maybe even after you choose to attend the institution, after you've paid a deposit. You might be asked for verification information this summer before the fall start, way after this process. I just want to reassure you that it's a legitimate process. It's not something to be afraid of. It's purely, as the name implies, it's a verification process. It's not a got you process, and it's not a we see some bad stuff and we want to fish a little bit more information. It's purely verification. Know your financial aid office. I just told you a moment ago, and this is very often in the introduction to these sessions, but it's a great time to touch on this now. All this information goes to an individual financial aid office. These offices, it's their federal responsibility for these federal forms. They have very specific legal responsibilities. And in the case of institution with large amounts of institutional aid, they're the gatekeeper, right? They have the rules. It's their money. Think about this personally. If you had a college and you had millions of dollars that you administer, you're going to be feeling very personal about that money, and you're probably going to have your own set of values and rules on how to administer that money. Think about that with private institutions. So as the gatekeeper, as the responsible party federally and from a state basis, as the rule maker on campus, these are the office controlling these funds. Get to know these people. Now, I might have made that sound scary. The people in financial aid offices, they do this. There's not a lot of pure joy in financial aid administration on its own. I tell you that as somebody who's been doing it for a long time. The joy is in helping families and working with students. Most financial aid professionals don't get paid a lot. The analogy to me are your school counselors who do this work to help families, help you students, help you. They don't get paid a lot. They're typically overworked, overtasked. Those are financial aid offices. Bottom line is this: the more they know about you, the more they can help you. The more you become personalized, the more they can help you. In my experience, families who are either missed through this process or hurt through the process, or treated less positively than they could through this process, it's because they were either unknown or slipped through the cracks or part of large numbers or large bureaucratic systems. So get to know these financial aid offices. If you have a change in circumstances, if you have individual circumstances that really didn't translate on these standardized forms, because these are standardized forms, if you had something change to financially to the detriment after you applied, contact these offices, get in touch with them directly, call them, email them, chat with them if they have it available. They can talk to you about changes in family circumstances, appealing offers, and so on. That's enough about this slide, but it's a key slide and a key principle through this process. Okay, I told you all this information goes to these colleges. What do they do with this information? First, they develop a thing called cost of attendance. This slide looks a little busy, but I'm going to help you digest it. Every college sets a cost of attendance for incoming students, also for returning students, different types of students, a major if they have different expenses. But it's going to vary from college to college, naturally, because colleges have different tuition amounts. They have different costs for room and board and so on. It may also differ because things like transportation, your expense to travel to the college, may vary depending on where you live and so on. While the college is going to bill you for things like tuition and fees, room and board if you live on campus, you still have other related expenses. You have books, that travel expense that I just alluded to, personal expenses. While a kid is in college, you have personal expenses, everyday expenses, food that's not covered through a meal plan, buying toiletries and personal supplies. Those expenses are related to college, and the colleges are allowed to consider those expenses in their evaluation for financial aid. So this cost of attendance, COA, you might see it referred to at times, includes then the blue sections, build costs, tuition and fees, room and board. If the student does not live on campus, that may not become a build cost, but there's still a related expense, right? To live in an apartment, or even the expense of transporting from home. There are indirect expenses, non-build costs, books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. Together, that's called this cost of attendance, okay? From the forms themselves, colleges are going to extract a thing called an expected family contribution. The expected family contribution is not necessarily leftover money you have each year. Most of us have no leftover money after expenses each year or each month. But it is intended to look at the ability of a family to absorb a cost in a given year. And by absorbing that cost, it may come from current income. It may also come from savings and assets, and that's why savings and assets are looked at as part of the calculation. It's also considered future ability to absorb costs. So for example, you'll notice that the FAFSA form asks for the age of the oldest parent. The presumption is an older parent has less ability to absorb future costs than a younger parent because you're close to retirement or closer to the end, right? But you have lesser ability as an older parent than a younger parent. So these factors behind the scenes are all taken into consideration for the expected family contribution. In the case of the FAFSA federal system, so this is something now, this is where I want to see your faces and see whether people are understanding this. In the case of FAFSA, federal system, federal aid, federal eligibility, I apologize for that. I never anticipated that. In the case of that federal system, there's one process, one way of evaluation. And for most private institutions, private colleges are going to have their own methodology and their own calculation for family contribution. I'll keep repeating this and giving you examples of this as I go through these examples. The bottom line is the primary calculus for you to get financial aid is this cost of attendance. So we talked about how that was built a moment ago, how colleges calculate cost of attendance, family contribution, and the difference is your eligibility for financial aid. And it's just that, it's an eligibility. Until the college puts together a financial aid package or applies that package toward you individually, it's only eligibility at this point, right? But the college's role, these people, these underpaid, overtaxed people who really want to help you, It's now their job to try to take all sources available, federal, state, the institutional sources, and put together a financial aid package, okay? So this might be an example. College A, the cost of attendance is $45,000, right? Family contribution is $5,000. Now this is where I'd launch into the audience. What's the difference? What's your eligibility? It's $40,000. I can hear you and see you jumping through the screen at lunch. You just put aside your sandwich and you said, Jim, I know the cost of attendance is 45, and I know the contribution is 5,000, and the difference is 40,000. That's the eligibility. So now the financial aid office is saying, what resources can I pull together from all sources available and build a financial aid package for the student? So it's that particular institution, maybe a private institution, they have funds available. They award merit scholarships. They also award need-based grant. So they've offered a scholarship for $10,000 for your son or daughter. They've offered grant of $17,500. I wouldn't get caught up in nomenclature too much. Some colleges refer to scholarships, but there's a little bit of a need-based component, and vice versa. Some colleges refer to grant, and there's a little bit of an academic component. You care that it's gift aid, and you care to know about how it gets renewed and if it gets renewed. That's your bottom line. But I wouldn't get caught up in the names. But in this particular case, the college is saying we can offer you $10,000 in scholarship and $17,500 in grant. We're going to offer you student loans, the Stafford loan. It's readily available. It's a fair source of money. It has good terms. And for all practical purposes, it's not a limited fund. It doesn't run out. So it's available for all students. We're going to leverage that, and we're offering you student loans as well. We're also offering you work study of $2,000. Now, be careful about this. Remember, I said work study is only as good as the student earning it. This $2,000 right now is a $2,000 offer for work, but it's not really something, if you're later trying to figure out your bill or calculate your bill, where you would deduct this from your account. That $2,000 is typically going to be used by the student for personal expenses and so on. Beer money, perhaps, we hope not, but it will be earned week to week, month to month, and typically applied to other parts of the costs. Now, at this point, this college has awarded $35,000. The family contribution was $5,000, eligibility was $40,000 now. The college has offered the family $35,000 out of $40,000. So remember a few moments ago with this slide, I said this eligibility, it's only as good as the money available with that particular college. So in this case, this college is saying, we can offer you, we know that your eligibility is $40,000. However, based on our resources, we have limited resources, for example, we can offer you $35,000. So in this particular case, there's a gap or unmet need, right? So in this particular case, the college is saying our cost is $45,000, your contribution is $5,000, your eligibility is $40,000, but we can only give you $35,000. In the end, and this is going to sound cynical, the intent is to be cynical. The intent is to help you learn and understand and be able to compare these awards in several months. In the end, that $5,000 in unmet need becomes the responsibility of the family. So in a sense, it artificially increases your contribution. So all this stuff, you know, when we talked earlier about the theory, this is theory until this point. Until you actually get awards, this is theory. This is reality now, and helps you decide which college to attend or which is most affordable and so on. Okay, and so here the slide's reminding you, unmet need is the family's responsibility. I'm going to give you some examples of this. We're going to beat it to death a little bit. So once again, in this particular case, excuse me, we're looking at multiple colleges. Let's say, for example, they all have the same cost of attendance, $45,000. The family contribution, according to them, is the same $5,000. But remember, if colleges have an institutional form or used a profile, they may not come up with the same contribution. But let's say that they did, it's $5,000. So eligibility is $40,000. This is not uncommon, the variation in packages among 3 different colleges. So we see college aid A awarded a total of $40,000. The blue line is the sum. College B awarded 33, college C awarded 25. all with the same eligibility. You notice that college B, A, B, and C all awarded the same amount of work study and student loan. The big difference was in the form of grant or scholarship. So not only is college A a richer package, but college A or a higher package overall, but it's a richer package. It has more percentage, more proportion of the good stuff. Remember, grant scholarship. Here's a different kind of example. Once again, 3 institutions, same cost of attendance, $45,000. Family contribution is 5, eligibility is 40. In this case, they all give the same package amount, right? That blue line, 35,000, 35,000, 35,000. Excuse me, but let's look at some other differences. Student loans are the same across the board. The gold bar, second down, 5,500. Work study is the same for the first 2 colleges, but nothing from the third college. The big difference is in the form of grants and scholarships. 27.5 from A, 17.5 from B. So don't get caught up in a trap where you might be looking at packages, college A and college B in this particular case. They both awarded $35,000. It's easy to reflexively say, hey, 35 for each. But in the case of A, it's a much richer package, greater amounts of grant and scholarship. And college B did a little bit of a trick. They plugged in your ability to borrow for a parent loan. It looks like an award in this presentation, but it's really not an award. You have the ability to borrow a parent loan anyhow. You can borrow it for your contribution. You can borrow it for unmet need. You can borrow it as a way to finance your share, but you can't really call it financial aid, and it really wouldn't become relevant to your calculus if you're trying to compare packages. Let me give you one last example on this. In this case, it's college A, college B, college C. This could also be college A across the board, student A, student B, student C. What do I mean by that? Colleges that have their own institutional funds, remember we called this money merit money. Need and merit money may be based on things like academics. It may be based on attractiveness of that student for that institution. And so in the case of student A, that student may be very attractive to this college. It's a high academic student. It's also a student who participates, say, in the band. So that college is willing to commit large amounts of dollars to that student to attend. Student B, the college is saying, has the same exact eligibility, $40,000, but it's not as strong a student, perhaps. It may not have the same need or competitive interest in getting that student to attend. So while they're acknowledging the need or the eligibility, they're not committing the funding. Again, this sounds like a cynical kind of way of presenting this. It's not intended to be cynical, but to make you on guard to compare this information when you get these packages, but also to have some understanding behind the scenes why colleges may make these decisions. They're not decisions that you should be taking personally or be offended by, but they should be alternate views that you're aware of so you can make these comparisons and make smart decisions. I'm going to pause once more for Jonathan at this point, because at this point we may have serious questions about eligibility. We got through the meat of the session. I'm going to talk about resources in a moment, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions about the meat of the session right now.
Yeah, we've had a few questions coming in. Some interesting, and I don't know if you can speak to it, but somebody has a question about if schools' endowments come into play when they're offering aid.
So if everybody couldn't hear this, Jonathan's question was, do school endowments come into play? Certainly, yes. So schools with large endowments, as you can imagine, have greater resources or greater flexibility in the money that they can apply to financial aid. So while the overall simplistic question is, yes, endowments make a difference. If a college, I'm not trying to oversimplify or sound insulting in the answer, but obviously if you compare 2 colleges, similar size, similar costs, and one has a greater endowment than the other, that college has a greater flexibility. Now, it may choose to not use a greater share for financial aid. but whether the college chooses to use a greater share of that money for financial aid, or simply is able to relieve stress on other kinds of expenses through the endowment, very often it translates in better types of financial aid. You can see this manifest itself. I talked about the high expense of colleges in New England, for example. Some of those colleges are private institutions with no endowment to speak of. They aren't able to award tons of financial aid. It's not that they don't want to. It's why I reminded you a moment ago what sounded like a cynical explanation of these differences isn't, in most cases, it's not a cynical, it's being administered cynically from the college. The college is saying, we know that families have need and eligibility. We don't have the resources to fund all of the need and eligibility of these families. So we portion out our money in relative shares. That's the reality that many colleges are faced with. So long answer to say, the simple answer, can endowments impact financial aid and what colleges can award? Sure. Very often you will not see a direct translation. Sometimes you might be offered an award directly from an endowment. Your son or daughter is eligible for a fund that was created through the endowment, and you met some very specific criteria for that fund, but it's all going to become part of this calculus, this eligibility overall. This does remind me to talk a moment about outside scholarships. Some families, I mentioned earlier that there are resources, there are databases that you can search to access outside scholarships. Many of your sons or daughters, because they're participating in the community, because they're good citizens, because they're active locally, may be offered money by local agencies or local organizations that can be applied to college. Many of you will hear myths and stories from family members and neighbors who say, don't bother with those scholarships. It's only going to be taken out of your financial aid. And they'll find some most very extreme example of someone, and it may not be a true example, it may be just myth, of someone who had X amount in scholarship, and when they applied the scholarship, the financial aid was taken away from them. I'm here to tell you, if you're offered local scholarships, take them. If you have a chance to apply for them, apply for them. In most cases, they will be able to help you and assist you. In most cases, you will not be negatively, well, you'll never be negatively impacted by these, but in most cases, they're going to help you. And let me give you a direct example. So we talked about this example. The family who was offered $35 out of $40,000. Now, legally, if this family had an eligibility of $35,000 and the package was $35,000 and you were offered an outside scholarship, legally, the college cannot give you funds that exceed the 35 in eligibility. But I already showed you an example, which is not unusual, where this particular college had unmet need. In this particular case, most colleges will say, oh, if you have outside scholarships up to $5,000, we will simply add on to your package. It will replace your unmet need. It will reduce your family share, and it doesn't impact your package because it's all within your need. There's a very direct reason to access an outside scholarship. The other example would be, let's call this unmet need an actual award. Many colleges will then have a policy saying, if you get additional outside scholarships, we will try to reduce your student loans or your work study first. So it may be that we're giving you 100% of your need or eligibility. You get an outside scholarship, we have to reduce your package, but we'll reduce the less good stuff, the loans and the work study. And so proportionately, you get a greater share of grant or scholarship. That's perhaps a question in your minds. It's perhaps something that you've heard from others, and I'd rather address that up front and put you at ease. Go for those outside scholarships, those local scholarships. Jonathan, sorry, if you have other questions, I want to pause.
Sure. So a good question here came in. When you fill out the FAFSA and the CSS profile, do your kids get access to all of everyone's personal financial information?
Oh, so yes, maybe. So in the case of the FAFSA, the student is the applicant, custodial parent is the applicant with the student, as I mentioned. And if the custodial parent is married, the new spouse, if it's two parents, the quick answer is yes, the student has access to that information. One thing that is an aside, it's not directly financial aid, but it is the college experience. Most of your sons or daughters, by the time they get to college or sometime during freshman year, turn 18, and the colleges consider them adults. And there are very specific federal rules about privacy and who is the main consumer and so on. And students suddenly become um, the consumers and have information available to them that the parents no longer have available. And you end up relying on your sons or daughters as sources of this information. I say this with experience as a financial aid administrator who has a son in college who is super bright, but has no consideration or wherewithal about forwarding information that he may receive, important information he receives from the college, and pass it on to his dad, the financial aid administrator. So I digress from the original question. Yes, on FAFSA information, that student will see or have access to that information. Some of it is masked. For example, if you use the IRS retrieval tool for tax information, that's going to be transmitted to the college and the student will never see the information. However, if the student wanted to walk into the college and say, I want the detail of my analysis and see these numbers, they have access to it. The exception is the profile process. The profile process asks for information from the student and custodial parent. And the profile process also has the ability for the non-custodial parent to submit information. And I should prepare you, this is a great question in other ways and something I should have touched on. Most private colleges will ask for information from the non-custodial parent, not the federal system, but for profile. And if they have institutional forms, they will ask for information from the non-custodial parent. Those processes are secure and they're separated. So information from a non-custodial parent will not be shared with the student, will not be shared with the custodial parent, and vice versa. So to repeat this, because I told the story along with it, federal process, the student is the applicant, the student will have access in theory to all information provided through the FAFSA application process. So it includes student, custodial parent, spouse, and so on. The profile process may also have a stream of application for non-custodial parents, so the divorced parent. That information is kept separate from the student, from the custodial parent. It's very secure. Colleges are very careful with that information. They honor that information. There are a lot of legal ramifications embedded there and privacy regulations embedded there. You can feel comfortable about that information, keeping safe and separate. Anything else, Jonathan? Sorry for a long answer to that.
No, I think that's good.
Okay, let me talk a little bit about how to pay for college. Go back over this stuff. We talked about this quickly today. Again, I have the handicap of not seeing you, not being able to answer quick questions, not seeing looks of confusion. So go over this information. Also listen to other people explain this information who may have clearer or better ways to talk about this. So we talked about this family contribution unmet need. So fast forward now, you've applied for financial aid at multiple colleges, you've been accepted to multiple colleges, those colleges have given you multiple financial aid offers. I hope that you've looked at not only bottom line, but the share of money, the colleges that have richer or more grant and scholarship assistance versus other types of aid. You've looked at all of this and explored this. You've now made a choice that becomes an academic choice and a financial choice. And now that you've chosen, you're saying, okay, now I've looked at the cost, the billed expenses. Now for financial aid, remember, considers non-billed expenses. But when it comes down to that bill that's going to come in the summer, it's really tuition and fees, room and board if applicable. That's what the college is sending you as an invoice. You're trying to come up with the difference then between that and the financial aid that's going to apply. Excuse me, that difference is going to be family contribution or unmet need or some combination. So in this example, the bottom line is you owe the college $20,000. Many families will look at that and say, obviously, I don't have $20,000 left over from this year. The college might say, well, we have a payment plan and you can pay this over the course of the year. And you say, okay, 20,000 over 10 months, that's 2,000 a month. I don't have 2,000 a month either, right? Some of you may say, I know I can borrow that, but I don't want to borrow 20,000 at the outset. So MEFA also offers tools to help you, as an aside, sort through this. Financial aid professionals are going to suggest that you look at multiple kinds of resources to pay for that balance due. So in this particular example, they're saying you've sat down with your son or daughter and they've been able to save $1,000 toward the bill. In your case, you may have some savings, some cash, some money in the bank, some stocks or bonds that you can access. It's not $20,000, but you might be able to come up with $4,000. You may choose then to spread out a portion of the $20,000 in the form of a payment plan. And you figure 10 months, you can maybe afford $500 a month. You can't afford $2,000 a month, but $500 a month, that's $5,000. And now you may need to borrow the difference, which is $10,000, but you're not borrowing $20,000 and you're not paying $2,000 a month. And I realize all of this sounds like an old oversimplification coming from a stranger over Zoom. But the point is, look at all different types of resources in order to pay that family contribution. It's easy. A reflexive reaction of families is to either think, I have to come up with all of this at once, which is impossible, or I have to borrow all of it, when there's typically some mixing and matching in between. And then the only other addition to this kind of thinking is to plan that over 4 years. So this mix may be one mix freshman year, it may be a different mix sophomore year. It may be by the end of the mix, this was my case, I'm borrowing more. At the beginning, I didn't have to borrow any. At the end, I'm borrowing a lot. So the mix may change over time. But you want to think about that freshman year, be thinking about how that mix will change over time and how your other sons or daughters may change that calculus if they're following later in college. So some quick conversations, and then we're over, so I'm gonna wrap in a moment. But some things to think about, or conversations that you might have, and some observations or cautions or myths about some of these conversations. Well, starting a community college save money, of course, right? So some students are saying, I want to graduate from a private 4-year institution. I want to graduate from any 4-year institution, a competitive institution. If a student starts at a community college and transfers after a year or 2 years, he or she still graduates from that next college. You still get a 4-year degree from the next college. And for some families where that's just out of reach for 4 years, it may be within reach for 2 years. And in order to accommodate that, you think about 2 years at a community college. I just alluded to the second bullet, the number of students you send it to college. If you have one that you're sending through college, there may be more pain that you can absorb, more borrowing that you can absorb, more ways to be flexible for that first child. If you have multiple kids coming along, multiple kids that you're going to send through college, the plans for the first one need to be factoring in the plans of the following students. It sounds like common sense, but much of this process, if you don't know, you're about to learn the hard way, is very emotional. And students, families fall in love with colleges. You fall in love with places. The reality is that there are many places that are good places for many students. I would argue that there is no one particular institution or one best institution for students, but it's easy to assume as much, and it's easy to fall in love with places. And when you fall in love with places, it's easy to make bad decisions. So try to remember that number in college, that 4-year enrollment, that it's not just the first year that you're paying for. I talk to families every day who would think, this is my plan. If I can do this, it's paid for. And I say, well, that pays for year 1. You should be thinking about your plan for years 2 through 4. And if your son or daughter is thinking that he or she may go to grad school, and you're going to try to help support them through grad school, then it becomes more than a 4-year calculus. It becomes a 5, 6, 7-year calculus, perhaps. And that's this next bullet. Ways to feel comfortable or feel knowledgeable, at least, even if it's not direct comfort, about student borrowing or ability to borrow is to research things like starting salaries for that college, starting salaries for that particular major. There are actually rules of thumb and very good information out there that says, based on this college, this major, you can expect to earn X. Based on this type of earning, you can expect to feel comfortable sourcing this percent, or at least, as I said, it may not make you comfortable with borrowing, but comfortable that it's not going to be out of reach, or that you're going to put yourselves or sons or daughters into some untenable position several years down the road. If you're thinking about borrowing for college, there are federal programs available. MEFA has some amazing programs with great rates and terms. Many private entities have loans available for college. Most of those private entities will use credit score. If they use credit score, then it helps to know your score and be prepared for that process, and be prepared for the competitiveness entailed in that process and how those lenders use score. Compare each school's net price. I've talked about this, but it's really that true cost of the college less the aid they're giving you. At that point, you're putting aside eligibility and all the theory. This is what the college costs. This is what they're giving me. The difference is my net price, right? That's how you're going to make these comparisons. These resources are terrific resources. I'm going to give you a break and not go through these individual slides, but I urge you to go back later, review these. FAFSA Day is a terrific face-to-face opportunity and virtual opportunity with financial aid professionals throughout the state. There are educational opportunity centers throughout the state that have terrific dedicated professionals that can help you one-on-one, help you with completion of forms, financial planning, evaluating the financial aid packages and comparing financial aid packages, and so on. This is a great guide staying on track through senior year. If I'm talking to some families of sophomores or juniors, if it's senior year, you're right here, right? It's here. The forms are this month, process is happening right away. If you're a little bit younger or families of younger students, this is a great guide walking you through those years, walking through the process, I'm sorry. Things you can do now, I told you tonight over a glass of wine at dinner, you're sitting at dinner and you're saying, geez, that Slattery guy, wasn't he brilliant and engaging this afternoon? And maybe I'll take his advice and we'll go in and get our FSA ID. And maybe we'll have John or Mary get their FSA ID this evening. It's something you can do tonight, although do it. You may have the wine in front of you, but do it before consuming the wine. Check out those deadlines and application deadlines for individual schools. There will be common deadlines for some of these forms, but schools will have their own. A rule of thumb, I didn't talk about this. Some families will say, well, I have all these deadlines. When do I apply then? Find the earliest, and that becomes your fixed deadline. The college or institution with the earliest dates, that's your personal deadline now. And now it will meet the deadline for all of the others. Just find that earliest one and follow the dates for that particular earliest one. Register and take advantage of these other webinars and blog posts through MEFA. I can't say enough about the organization. You can connect with them through social media. You can talk to them. They have great advisors who will give you one-on-one information. And Jonathan, either we can let people go or I have time if we have other important questions or final comments from you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. No, I think we're okay. I would just say that you will be getting an email with this recording and with the slides that you can refer back to probably by tomorrow. And then as Jim said, we are a resource for you to continue to refer to. And other than that, I think that's it. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you for hanging in, everyone, and best wishes with everything. Good luck with this. As I said, I've been through it. Good luck to you all. Thanks.
Thank you.